Laboratory in Tumamoc. We are thrilled to have you here for our artist series, which is a collaboration among Tumamoc, the Southwest Center, and UA Press. So thank you so much for coming. I am thrilled to introduce first Dr. Ted Fleming, who's been a professional biologist for over 50 years. He has studied ecological interactions between seed and or pollen dispersing American leaf-nosed bats, the cutest of all the bats, and their food plants in Latin America. His pollen dispersal studies were conducted in the Sonoran Desert of Mexico and Arizona between 1989 and 2000. Let's see. He and his students studied the evolution of American leaf-nosed bats in the West Indies between 2000 and 2006, and his current research involves the use of hummingbird feeders by nectar bats in southern Arizona in collaboration with a group of Israeli bat biologists in the ecology and evolution of tropical vertebrate plant mutualistic interactions worldwide. Birds, Bats, and Blooms is his 11th book. And he will be having a conversation with Dr. Stephen Buchmann. Yes, great. Dr. Stephen Buchmann is an adjunct professor in the departments of entomology and ecology and evolutionary biology at the U of A. He specializes in pollination ecology along with the nesting and mating biology of Sonoran Desert bees, the cutest of all the bees. His current interests are with oil collecting centris bees. I do plants, I'm sorry. Buzz pollination, the bacterial and fungal microbiomes of bee brood cells. Steve has published 250 scientific articles and 11 nonfiction books. His most recent books are The Reason for Flowers and What a Bee Knows. So let us welcome our speakers.
Welcome, and come inside, take a look. Yeah, it's great to be here. We're going to kind of set the stage this evening for why we have pollinators and flowers. We'll probably take some journeys around Arizona, as well as some of the other places Ted and I have been around the world studying birds, bats, and bees. Later, I'll try to remember to tell a few stories about some interactions right here on Tumamoc Hill, especially my favorites like the oil baron bees and buzz pollination. Anyway, pass it along to Ted here.
Okay, we're going to try to cover 120 million years of angiosperm evolution in a mere 1 hour. Okay, so I'm not sure it can be done, but most of the action in terms of pollination biology of angiosperms has been at the hands of invertebrates. So of that 120 million years, Steve is responsible for 100 million years, and I'm only responsible for 20 million years. So I better pass the baton to Steve, and I will tell him when I get to say my few words. By the way, the birds and bats, those are my photographs, my photo art, and so forth. So that's what I kind of do in my spare time.
What a wuss, only the short evolution of birds and bats compared to insects. And I will say something about the slides here. Ted has some of his beautiful photographic work and then derived artworks and digital art from that with birds and bats. Mine is pretty much a volant bestiary. And this is a collection of, that one's not my photograph. That one is by global wildlife photographer who a couple of years ago, Karen Eigner in Texas and Washington, D.C., won World Wildlife Photographer of the Year for that photo of a mating ball of Diadasia, cactus bees, looking for a hapless female in that big bee ball to mate with. And I've had the pleasure of working with her for a number of years. The other slides, or the bee slides, are a combination of my own slides and my dear photographic buddy Bruce Taubert up in Mesa. Some of you may have seen many of his photos in Arizona highways. Okay, back to the birds and bees and bats. I want to back up a little bit and preface things by saying sex makes the world go around, and it always has. And way back when, for plants, water was essential for sperm-like cells swimming through water to get to ovules or other female structures like ovules. And if you think of algae in the sea, in the fresh water, mosses on land in damp habitats, and even lichens on rocks, those all require water at certain times of the year for their sexual reproduction. Once things really moved into drier, more xeric habitats, things weren't so great. Certainly some flowering plants are water pollinated, they're underwater. Some weird plants actually send flowers to the top of water like little boats, and the surface tension attracts them together. And then there are wind pollinated things like we have with all the jojoba, Simonsia chinensis, right here at Tumamoc Hill. But water and wind especially are pretty messy, and you have to send out very Sagan-esque numbers, right? Billions and billions of propagules to try to find a female. And that's pretty messy. It does work, but along come insects, and before flowering plants, which evolved, as far as we know, the earliest fossils we have of pollen grains before macrofossils for angiosperms, the flowering plants, are about 130 or so million years ago. Although there is a controversy that some angiosperms may have evolved much earlier, but most of these things have been discredited for Triassic or Jurassic origins of flowering plants. So think of early Cretaceous. Before that, the world was very green. There were no flowers. Earth was brown or green, but the greenness was due to ferns and cycads and seed ferns and benedictalians and all kinds of weird plants that you probably haven't heard of. They produced little droplets, pollination droplets, and some of them captured pollen on the breezes, but others used those pollination droplets to entice early pollinators. And two of my favorites, I should have stuck a couple slides in, but there's something that have been referred to as Mesozoic butterflies, and these were giant lacewings, so like the green and brown lacewings that might show up at your porch light at night and are only about 1 centimeter long. Some of these things were as big as your hand and had giant eye spots on their hind wings. They looked very much like modern butterflies, and they were probably just as colorful. These critters had tongues, proboscides, that were 2 or 3 centimeters long, sometimes longer, and they probed at these pollination droplets, and they spread the pollen from plant to plant. Similarly, there were other early gymnosperm pollinators that are called scorpion flies, and these also had long beaks and reached down into these crevices to slurp up the sweet nectar. So there was this incredible cache of animals that pollinated these early gymnosperms before angiosperms came on the scene. So I'll come back to flies and beetles in a bit, but I want to pass it along to Ted.
That was pretty fast for 100 million years. Come on, Steve, you're too modest. But the critters I'm interested in and have been studying for over 60 years actually, have been around for, say, 30 to 20 million years. So they're very much newcomers on the pollination scene. And they have evolved and co-evolved with plants that had insects as their ancestral pollination mode. So think about a bee or a butterfly and the energetic needs of those kinds of animals compared to even a small hummingbird, like our calliope hummingbirds, or nectar-feeding bats. They're in the range, bats are in the range of 3 to 20 grams. It's not very large, but it's still orders of magnitude bigger than most insect pollinators, okay? So in order to entice big energetic pollinators, and both birds and bats are homeotherms, right? Everybody knows what a homeotherm is? Raise your hand.
Some insects too.
Raise your hand if you're a homeotherm. I mean, those are two groups of animals whose metabolism and body temperature is all internally produced, right? And they have large energy budgets. Hummingbirds that hover are hovering at about 10 times higher than their normal resting metabolic rate. So, in order to entice these large, energetically expensive pollinators, you've got to do certain things. And I'll let you think about that for a little bit, and I'll pass the baton back to Steve, because he's still got 95 million years to count for.
Oh, the pressure is on. Okay, so I'm going to mention what we know about some of the insect pollinators. One thing that I learned at Cal State Fullerton as an undergraduate and a graduate student under the late great Gene Jones, you know, a lot of people, a lot of botanists at the time thought that the most primitive flowers were huge, so that they thought that the earliest flowers that evolved way back in the early Cretaceous were something like a magnolia, or maybe a tulip tree. You know, some magnolia flowers are bigger than my hand. That turned out to be wrong. So finally, we got some fossils from, believe it or not, some rather unremarkable clay pits in New Jersey. And during the Cretaceous at this site, there were apparently wide-ranging wildfires that roared through these forests and created literally charcoalified, I don't know what the word is, anyway, turned them to carbon, instant carbon replicas of these flowers. And all of the earliest known Cretaceous flowers that we know were 1, 2, maybe 3 millimeters across, really tiny. Would not be impressive as a prom corsage or a bouquet. So along with pollinating these flowers, you require, usually there's a good match, a morphological or physical match between pollinator and bloom, just like bat pollinated flowers are some of the largest flowers. Well, these were pollinated by tiny wasps and bees. Actually, some of the very earliest pollinators on the scene, predating bees, were flies and beetles. My colleague Brian Danforth at Cornell University a few years ago published something that was from the Myanmar amber of Burma, Myanmar. And they described this as Melitospex burmensis, and it was in amber. There are some gorgeous, some of you may, like me, have been prowling around the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show looking for fossils in amber or otherwise. And some of these things were exquisitely preserved. Well, long story short, Melitospex burmensis was not a bee. It's kind of a proto-bee. It had some characteristics that are bee-like, but too bad. It turns out to be a wasp. Where do bees come from, evolutionarily speaking? Well, they evolved from wasp ancestors. And about 5 or maybe between 5 and 10 years ago, there was a really fascinating study that proposed that bees evolved from very small wasps called amoplanine wasps. And these wasps were predators like most wasps are today, except for like sawflies and that sort of thing. So these wasps were going to flowers not for the pollen or nectar, but thrips. For the gardeners in the crowd, right, you hate thrips. They're ruining your rose bushes, creating messy petals and all this stuff. Anyway, thrips were an ancient group, but they were a good food supply for these wasps. So our current idea is that bees evolved from these amoplanine wasps that were eating thrips that were covered in pollen. And eventually the bees said, hey, nuts to these thrips, I'm just going to eat the tasty pollen and slurp up the nectar. So we think that's how we got bees. Let's see, throw in a couple of weird little facts. People always say there are no honeybees in the Americas except for the ones that came over with the Spanish, right? And they're not native. There are about 8 species in the true honeybees in the genus Apis, but they mainly evolved in tropical Asian rainforests. So for years and years I said, no, we never had any honeybees here except for the domesticated, quote domesticated. That's a little pet peeve of mine. I think that we basically provide crummy homes for bees in Langstroth colonies, but they're not like our native bees. So long story short, there was a fossil discovered that's about 13 million years old near Las Vegas, Nevada. And it's a perfect imprint of a honeybee. And you can see various features that we know it's a honeybee. You can see the sting, you can see the hemily on the wings. Wing venation in bees is characteristic down to the species level. So that's really pretty neat. Before I forget, I'm going to tell you a couple of things of how you can recognize a bee, because people always come up to me and say, is it a bee, Steve, or is it a wasp? Well, get out your hand lens or microscope. Bees are fuzzy. They're quite robust. I mean, there are some bees that are kind of skinny and almost hairless, like the genus Hyleus and the Calididae, but by and large, bees are like little flying teddy bears, right? They're very cute. Think of a bumblebee, black and yellow, charismatic bee. If you look under a microscope or a good hand lens, those hairs are branched. I should be proper and call them seedy, but I'll call them hairs. They have little side branches, hundreds and hundreds of them. Those hold on to the pollen grains. That's one characteristic. You'll never find branched hairs on a wasp, but for some of those wasp-like bees, you have to look really hard to find those hairs. Another weird thing, pollen grains tend to be sticky with a lipid fatty coat called the pollen kit, but sometimes bees are aided in their pollen collecting through just passive physics. Any object that flies through the air, whether it's a baseball, Super Bowl football, or a 767 jumbo jet, acquires a very strong electrostatic charge. So bees can develop pretty strong dozens, sometimes even hundreds of volts of charge as they fly. Plants are literally and figuratively grounded. They have a negative charge. So sometimes you just have this passive jumping of an air gap of pollen grains onto a bee. I think that's pretty cool.
I can't top that at all. So, I've been interested in these 2 families of vertebrate pollinators, the hummingbirds and the American leaf-nosed bats, for quite a while. I don't suspect that most of you know that hummingbirds, which we typically think as a New World family of birds, 300 plus species of these birds, they actually evolved in Eurasia. So the earliest hummingbird fossils come from shale deposits in Germany or Yugoslavia, and they're dated at 30 to 32 million years. And you look at their structures, and they look like modern hummingbirds. Closest relatives of hummingbirds are swifts. You all know swifts. Those are diurnal insect-eating birds, and their ancestry, as well as the hummingbirds, dates back to the night birds, such as, owlet frogmouths. You all know those, nighthawks, nightjars, and so forth. So the ancestry comes from nocturnal insect eating, and these 2 families, the swifts and the hummingbirds, broke that mold and became diurnal, with the hummingbirds becoming diurnal flower visitors. The swifts, of course, are chasers of insects. The bats are strictly New World in their origin and in their diversification. There's about 216 species of American leaf-nosed bats. Only about 56 of those species are actually dedicated, morphologically dedicated flower visitors. The bulk of the relatives of the nectar feeders are either insectivorous or fruit eaters. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage. As I've indicated, both the hummingbirds and the bats date from 30 to 20 million years. And so that's pretty recent in geological time. Where are we in the world right now? What do we see outside? What's its name? Sonoran Desert. What's unique about the Sonoran Desert compared to other deserts in the world? I'm sorry? Everybody's got low rainfall. But no other desert in the world has these large columnar cacti. And these large columnar cacti originally evolved to attract bats. Now, we all know that saguaro up here is not necessarily bat pollinated. Its major pollinators are white-winged doves. Okay? And bees, but bees are minor. But so we're in a really unique kind of environment here in which there are resources, flower resources, for hummingbirds and nectar-feeding bats, and that's not the case in any other desert in the world. Okay?
Bee diversity. Around the world, I said for many, many years that we have, and all my colleagues said this too, so I wasn't the only one lying. We had 21,000 species of described bees. Well, a recent paper, actually I think it's still in press, but anyway, by John Asher, now at Singapore University, and some of his colleagues, they've done a new study, and what we think we have is somewhere between 25,000 and 28,000 species of bees around the world. To put that into perspective, I'm not a good birder. What do we have? About 6,000 or 8,000 species of birds,
You're
something
off,
like that.
man. Stick to bees.
How many do we have?
11,000.
Oh, okay. Whoa. 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 Egg on my face. Let's see. Okay, so let's say we have 25,000 species of bees. Some of the vertebrate groups that would be more diverse. Fish, hope I'm right on this, maybe 39,000 species of fishes, something like that. How many do we have in the United States? Well, we have just under 4,000. We used to think that Arizona was the best bee real estate in the world, and it's very, very good. Bees tend to live in dry, xeric habitats. One of the reasons we think for that is that about 75% or more species of bees are solitary, and they're typically what we say is odorless, ground nesting. So they're nesting in the ground, or some of them nest in pithy twigs, or locally we have our giant carpenter bees, which have very powerful mandibles, and they can nest in agaves, sotols, and yuccas. And then you have bees, especially social bees, like bumblebees and stingless bees. We have about 600 species of stingless bees. They only come up to within about 400 miles of the US-Mexican border. So if you want to see stingless bees, you hang out in Costa Rica or Panama or Brazil. They tend to nest either in cavities underground or in the boles of hollow trees. And they take wax that is made from glands in their body and mix the wax with resins, plant resins, and that's called cerumen. So Google stingless bee nest tonight, and you'll be amazed at some of the incredible and beautiful architecture that they form. Bumblebees, we don't have many in the desert. Locally, we have Bombus sonorus, and if you want to see more bumblebees, you need to go up onto Mount Lemmon. But they typically nest in abandoned mouse nests with a little bit of grass, that sort of thing. But why do bees generally like to nest in the ground? Well, I think it's because, they like to nest in well-drained sandy soils, not just anywhere. So typically in tropical rainforests, they're not nesting in the ground because there are huge numbers of pathogenic fungi and other bad guys that can get them. Plus they can be flooded. You know that there are forests in the Amazon rainforest that are flooded for months out of the year. Not a good place to nest. So we have a very, very rich biota of bees here, right on Tumamoc Hill. One of my favorites, I think I'll just mention it right now, we have some very interesting plants that are oil flowers. These flowers smell like raspberries. In fact, I did some chemical work with my colleague Rob Raguso at Cornell, and we determined that beta-ionone, the main compound in ripe red raspberries, is being pumped out of these flowers to attract the bees. It's my favorite bee genus, the genus Centris, C-E-N-T-R-I-S, and we have about 20 species in Arizona. But typically they are tropically adapted bees, and we have a few of them slopping up into the Sonoran Desert, which, as Ted mentioned, you look outside and you see this lush, lush desert, right? Put it desert in quotes because compare this to the Gobi Desert, no comparison. So these female bees go to these flowers and they have special squeegee hairs on their front legs, and they adopt a four-legged stance and they twirl around on these flowers and they rupture these oil blisters. Just like if you're out in the garden, working in the garden, and you get a water blister on your hand, they have, these flowers look similar but on a microscopic scale. So this very highly energetic, nutritious oil is collected by these bees on, not onto sponges, but onto something almost as good, onto very coarse hairs on the hind legs, and they take it home. What do they do with it? Well, they feed it to the kids, to their larvae in brood cells underground. They also biochemically transform it, this oil, into hardened wax-like material. And this is something I'm working on now with the lab in Germany. We don't exactly know the biochemical pathways, but we're trying to sort this out. So they make a wax-like waterproof lining that helps protect them from microbes and being drenched, being waterlogged.
How do I follow that up? Let's see. Where do I want to go? There are over 360 species of hummingbirds, and they've been in the New World for at least 22 million years, and they've diversified into 9 genetically and morphologically recognizable subfamilies. The ones that we have up here are some of the youngest subfamilies, the bees, the mountain gems, the emeralds. The old guys are still stuck in the undergrowth, understory of tropical forests. The bats that I study here are at the northern limit of the family of American leaf-nosed bats. The lesser long-nosed bat, the Mexican long-tongued bat, they don't even make it to Phoenix, thank God. So the family stops right about here. How many of you have seen the nectar visiting bats visiting your hummingbird feeders? That's a great thing to watch. And I've been watching it along with my Israeli colleagues for a number of years now. These are fantastic bats. We finally have got the technology to be able to put tiny transmitters on our bats visiting hummingbird feeders here in October and preparing to migrate south. These are long-distance migrant bats, the lesser long-nosed bat. Unusual in the whole family because most of the species of American leaf-nosed bats are not migratory at all. So leptos, that's the genus, Leptonicterus, visiting your hummingbird feeders are here seasonally, and then they head south. And what we've learned from putting little transmitters on these bats last October is that some of the tagged individuals travel very far, very fast. Think about flying from Tucson to Mazatlan, a distance of about 1,000 kilometers, in 2 or 3 nights. They don't spend any time tarrying on their migration south. Okay? And all age classes, the young bats as well as the full adults, are doing that same thing. One of the intriguing questions that we're trying to solve is how do juvenile bats that have never been around here before, how do they choose a place to feed? They do it very quickly as far as we can tell, and they're using washes as their highways. So if you have a hummingbird feeder in a yard near a wash, you're likely to get many more bats than in my yard where I'm not that close to a wash. Another thing that's coming out from this research is we've taken DNA samples from all of our bats that we catch and tag. And it turns out the full analysis is not completely done, but bats that are being caught together at the same hummingbird feeder are more closely related than you would expect by chance. It looks like the social structure of these bats is based on relatedness. And stay tuned for the full story, but that's something we really didn't know until the last couple of years. Fascinating stories. And again, hummingbird feeders don't look anything like flowers. So why have bats switched from visiting flowers in the late summer, early fall? Their major food source, flower source, are paniculate agaves, Agave palmeri. That's their favorite food, and it's found in southeastern Arizona in Cochise County. But through time, beginning in about 2007, more and more nectar-feeding bats are visiting our feeders in town. 2 species, the Mexican long-tongued bat, they kind of hang out in the foothills of the Catalinas, and the lesser long-nosed bat, they're everywhere. Downtown, uptown, east town, west town, and their numbers have been increasing in the last couple of decades. Okay, pretty interesting. These bats raise a lot of interesting questions that we can address experimentally and with the new technology.
Those nasty robber bats. They're really smart. Almost as smart as a bee. So
He's so biased, it's pathetic.
some of these people that had hummingbird feeders out, bat feeders, down in the Portal area, I don't know how long ago, maybe 2 decades ago, maybe longer, discovered that when they would dutifully mix up their sugar water and put it out at night, so the early hummingbird gets the juice, they go out there in the morning and go, what the heck? The feeders were drained. So I think that was where it started in far southeast Arizona and probably New Mexico. But now it's a common thing, as Ted said, and maybe Ted can give you the, I'm forgetting the name of the website for reporting that. Do you know it offhand? Or
We have in collaboration with Arizona Game and Fish and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and me, retired former faculty member, we have a website. We have a citizen science project. How many of you are members of that citizen science project at this point? What?
Ooh, you need to sign up.
Oh my gosh, you laggards. This is, we typically get 50 to 100 families or sites monitoring visitations to their hummingbird feeders in the late summer, early fall, and they report to us on a website when they first arrive at their place, when they last arrive, when they disappear from the place, and when their peak numbers are. And we know that's about mid-September. So we have a cadre of enthusiastic people that are really into these nectar bats. I'm sorry you folks are not part of that very nice group, but myself and my Israeli colleagues, we've published 3 papers already on the results of the Citizen Science Project, and more will be forthcoming. So just send an email to me and I can tell you the Arizona Game and Fish website. I can't remember the address. It changes periodically, so it's a moving target. But there's a way for citizens to get involved in learning more and more about these nectar-feeding bats.
Good. Don't you feel guilty? You should. I'm going to just tell about one experiment that I think is so cool, done by a colleague of mine, Lars Chitka, in England. So I'll preface this by saying, and you can argue with me later, but I think that bees are super intelligent. I think they're sentient, a little bit of self-awareness, and they can be tool using. So Lars Chitka and his students worked with bumblebees, and they trained bumblebees to go to these little depressions in a little plastic sled, right? So little depressions that are filled with yummy, yummy sugar water. This was covered by another piece of plexiglass, so the bees couldn't directly get to it. The sled, the plastic sugar sleigh, was attached with a piece of string, maybe 3, 4, 5 centimeters long. And the bees had to pull the little sled out from under the transparent cover to dive in and get the sugar. As amazing as that is for tool using, excuse me, I want to tell you about social learning, which is even more mind-blowing. Lars took totally naive bees that had never seen an artificial flower or a real flower, took them out of their colony, put them up into a little bee skybox, just like at the Super Bowl, and they got to watch their trained nestmates pull the string to get the treat. As soon as those totally naive bees in the skybox were let out, they immediately flew down and pulled the string and got the sugar. So this was social learning. They had learned a very complex act simply by watching their fellow nestmates, which I think is remarkable. And if you go online and look up Lars Chitka or just, I don't know what you would, anyway, bumblebee string pulling for a reward or something. There are also great videos on YouTube of bees that have been trained to play soccer. So they roll little soccer balls into a goal to get a sugary reward, which I think is fun. Okay, so I can't be my moniker of the buzzman, which the late great Justin Schmidt gave me, without telling a buzz pollination tale. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I've worked on this thing of buzz pollination since the 1970s, first discovering it for myself in high school. So about 20,000 or so plants around the world in numerous families, I think I'm up to about 80 plant families now, have anthers that are bright yellow, but they're elongated. So think of a big yellow hot dog with 1 or 2 holes, usually 2 holes in the tip. These are apically, porocidally dehiscent anthers. They look like they're full of pollen, and they are, but if you take your fingers and rub it along there, nothing comes off. And even if you turn the flower upside down, nothing comes off. Takes a bee in the know. We have my former PhD student, Avery Russell, who's now a professor at Missouri State University. Our master list now has something like 90 species of bees that are recorded in the literature performing this floral sonication or buzz pollination. So a bee will come up, let's take a bumblebee because that's a very familiar example, and the female will use her sharp mandibles, bite the base of that anther, and hang on for dear life. And during the bite, she uses the indirect flight muscles in her thorax, which are very, very strong muscles, the flight muscles, and she shivers, just like us shivering to stay warm. So the contraction of those muscles without moving the wings is turning her body into essentially what is a living tuning fork. And instantly, not all, but a lot of that pollen bounces around, pollen grains hit each other, pollen grains hit the wall, and very, very soon they reach escape velocity and they come zipping out of those pores in the form of a cloud. They hit the female bee on her thorax and abdomen and on her legs. And she'll typically hang on by one leg and go through some very complicated grooming maneuvers to collect this pollen and pack it. So it is really a cool thing to do. And if you go out many places in the world, even Tumamoc Hill or some botanical gardens or maybe your own garden, here's a good one. If you're a tomato grower, watch your tomatoes because this is the most common agricultural crop example, along with blueberries, cranberries, eggplant, chili peppers, kiwi fruit. Those are the main agricultural crops that have flowers like these salt shakers that the bees need to vibrate to collect the pollen. Most of these flowers, with the exception of things like blueberries or cranberries, don't have any nectar. They're pollen only. But this pollen is a super, super rich food. It can be 50 to 60% protein, where the normal run-of-the-mill lily, apple blossom, pollen, whatever, might be 20 or 25%. So it's a really very, very rich reward for bees.
How's our time? Okay, so when you buy my book, and if you aren't a member of our Citizen Science Project, the least you can do is buy my book. Its 2 major themes are how to build a hummingbird and how to build a nectar bag. And it goes into fairly detailed information about the major features of these 2 groups. Birds and bats last shared a common ancestor 300 million years ago. So the birds and the bats have not co-evolved together for very long, and they're not closely related, obviously. But there are a number of really intriguing similarities in the biology of these hummingbirds and the bats. For example, they both hover. And most other kinds of bats, most other kinds of birds don't hover at flowers. They can quickly digest their nectar food and convert it into ATP molecules in the mitochondria of their flight muscles. So they're feeding on the wing and they're building energy-rich molecules at the same time. And the biochemical pathways in both hummingbirds and nectar bats are very similar, which is kind of interesting. Very good example of biochemical convergent evolution. But from that point on, the differences between hummingbirds and bats are pretty profound. You all know that hummingbirds are basically solitary, mostly territorial feeders, right? They're very feisty and they do a lot of fighting. My nectar bats are highly gregarious. They roost in colonies of 10, 20, 100,000 individuals crammed in the same cave or mine, and they all go out to forage, often independently, but sometimes together. And they are not territorial. You can watch with your trail camera the nectar bats visiting your feeders and see what fun they're having. They will visit the hummingbird feeder, and then they'll fly around with their compatriots, like they're doing follow the leader, and then come back. And they're burning a lot of energy doing that, but they're getting a lot of energy from the hummingbird feeders. But you can't build a bat on just sugar water alone. These bats need other kinds of chemical components, for example, proteins. Where do bats get their proteins from? They get them, surprisingly, from ingesting pollen. They can digest the goodies out of pollen grains in their stomach, and then they convert those chemicals into useful building blocks in their bodies, energy sources, and so forth. Hummingbirds are piss poor at dealing with pollen. They can't eat it. Even if you stick it in their stomachs, they can't digest pollen grains. They've got an alternate source of proteins, of course, insects. So you might think of hummingbirds as really insectivorous birds that have incidentally become flower visitors feeding on energy-rich sugar. Bats themselves are more advanced in the sense that they can build proteins from the pollen grains of flowers, as well as getting energy from the nectar.
I am going to put in a shameless plug for my 2 latest books, which are out on the table. They're not for sale, but my latest book is What a Bee Knows, published by Island Press in Washington, D.C. But that shameless Princeton University Press just bought out Island Press, but they're keeping it as an imprint. And then the book before that, I titled The Reason for Flowers, which was from Simon & Schuster, and that's also out there. And I have some little cards if you want to email me with any questions, that sort of thing. I'm going to give you one last little quick in quotes, bee fact, and then I think maybe we should turn it over to questions from you guys. Okay, so microbes make the world go around in our stomach and buying those horrible probiotics, right? All that stuff that you've heard about. Well, it turns out that my colleagues at Cornell, UC Riverside, UC Davis, my alma mater, yay, and a number of other places, we've been working for the last 5 years trying to figure out what are the helpful, beneficial bacteria and fungi in bee stomachs, both adult bees and larval bees. Long story short, we're finding lots and lots of diversity, but the most interesting one, I think, is the fact that some bees are almost making yogurt. So they're using yogurt bacteria, lactobacilli, and some related bacterial genera to ripen and process the food that the bee babies, the larvae underground, are eating. One of the scary things our group found out is that the chemical industry has said for decades and decades that herbicides are safe. Herbicides are safe, they're safe, they're safe. For bees, they're not safe for humans, as you know, with Roundup and that sort of thing. But the herbicides are killing the helpful microbiome in bee larval stomachs and in brood provisions. So creating a sublethal or outright lethal effect. Anyway, so that's all I'm going to say about that. This is something that we just found out about a year ago. Want to open it up for questions?
Absolutely. I gotta sit down because I'm an old guy. See if I can sit down.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
You mind passing the microphone?
Do you know how to build a hummingbird feeder to keep his bees out?
Keep the old bees out.
Yes. How can you train your hummingbird feeder to exclude bees?
The bees
I don't-
swarm.
Well,
Hummingbird feeders.
Only those nasty honeybees, which I
yeah,
introduced.
they're not a problem in my yard, so I don't think about it. I'm sorry.
Come to my.
Yeah, no thanks with all the bees. No.
Other questions? I'm gonna pass the microphone. I'm really bad about repeating questions, so with this, we know what the question is.
With those centuries bees, there's this. First, was the closest relatives to centuries, and how did they get into the whole oil thing, evolutionarily speaking?
Interesting. I didn't have a slide of the nasty, complicated phylogenetic tree, but yay. Genera like Anthophora and Habropoda, those are quite closely related. Centris are big, beautiful, colorful bees. Not all of them. I should have this figure at the tip of my tongue. I don't. But only some of them collect oil. My favorite bee that sometimes has nested here on Tumamoc Hill, one time the nest site was almost 20 acres, covered almost 20 acres with tens of thousands of bees, hundreds of thousands of bees. They don't collect oil. They don't have those oil squeegees on their front legs. Other bees right here, in fact, a buddy of mine found about 10, 15, maybe 20 years ago now, a big nest site of Centris cockerelli that is nesting in the flower beds at St. Mary's Hospital. We combed Tumamoc Hill for years and maybe found 5 or 10 nests. And then he was taking his wife to a medical appointment. He's going by the flower beds and going, whoa, I should tell Steve about this. And those are oil bees that go to the Primaria, the raspberry scented flowers. That there are 2 species, one very common species on Tumamoc Hill. So anyway, long story short, we don't really know about the evolutionary origins of oil collecting in Centris, but some do it, some don't. Thank you.
What's the best type of sugar to use for hummingbird feeders? And in addition to that, are there some that are harmful?
What are the best sugars for hummingbird feeders, and are some harmful?
We don't know whether they're harmful. We don't actually know the demographic consequences of feeding on hummingbird sugar. Everybody in this area creates a sugar solution. You buy your sugar, if you're a bat person, you buy it by the 50 pounds, because the bats really suck the goodies out of your feeders night after night. If you live near a wash, okay. But the ratio is 4 to 1, right? 4 units of water and 1 unit of nectar, or sugar, I should say. And in my feeders, it's about 22% sugar. And the bats come back. And I forgot to mention one interesting thing. These bats do drain feeders. And I've been trail camming my feeders for a number of years. And I found that if the feeder is drained by midnight, bats continue to visit it until 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. These feeders, my feeders, are empty. And I've convinced some of my citizen science buddies to do the same observations in their yard, and we know that these nectar-feeding bats are visiting empty feeders night after night after night. And what's the benefit? We know they're expending a lot of energy flying around, playing hide and go seek and tag and that thing, but they're coming back to empty feeders. And you can watch their tongues in my videos, their tongues searching around the bottom of a hummingbird feeder, not finding any, maybe a molecule, but nothing really that would sustain them. So that's an unanswered question. Why? What's the benefit to visiting empty feeders, particularly this time of the year when they're building up fat reserves to fuel their migratory behavior. So we've got a paradox on our hands.
The feeder can't signal the way a flower can, that it's been visited by a pollinator.
That's right, but the bees can discover, oh, I'm sorry, the bees.
Sorry, he's got
Never
me.
go to an empty feeder.
Yeah, bats quickly learn that the feeders are empty, but we have tag bats. So we know it's the same individual night after night coming back to an empty feeder. I don't understand it.
I was given the 1 minute left to go thing about 5 minutes ago, so I'm going to stay inside here and be glad to answer any bee questions and even bat ones that I might fumble my way through. But I think we need to let Ted go out and sell some books, buy some books.
Thank you all so much for coming. Really quickly, I've promised the good folks here at Tumamoc that we would all have our time with the authors and then be out of here by 7 p.m. so that the staff that's helped make this possible for us can get on their way and get home to their families. So let's thank Ted and Stephen for such a